Good morning, everyone. My name is Linda McKean. I'm one of the social studies consultants with the Ohio Department of Education, and this morning we are going to be hearing from Christina Hartlieb, the Executive Director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Historic Site. And just a few housekeeping things before we get going here. Please mute your mic and turn off your video just as a way to save bandwidth here. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat box and we'll make sure that Christina can hear them. I will share them with Christina, so I'll monitor the chat box. Also, certificates for 1 credit hour contact hour will be emailed to you in the next day or so. If you would like, if you go ahead and put your name in the Google Doc that I will post the link to towards the end of the presentation. Just go ahead, put your name and information in there, and we will send you the contact hour. And I also want to give people a heads up that we are recording this, and it will be saved and converted to a YouTube video that gets posted later. Stay tuned for when those will be posted. And let me go ahead and turn this over to Christina now, and let's get started.
Hi, welcome. My name is Christina Hartlieb. I'm the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. And in case you're wondering where that is, we are located in the Walnut Hills neighborhood of Cincinnati. You've seen the front of the house. This picture here is from kind of the rear side view of the house. And I'm starting to use that as our opening picture because you see the new visitor ramp that's been constructed. We have relocated the visitor door to the side because we're going to be having some restoration work done on the north and west facades, which would include the front of the house later this year. So we needed to close that off and to open up the side door with a new ramp for accessibility. So if you are driving on I-71, you get off at the Martin Luther King exit, go about not even half a mile to the east, and that's where the house is located. So today we're going to be talking about the house itself, about Harriet Beecher Stowe, and about some resources for educators. So here's kind of my basic agenda. I used to be a social studies high school teacher myself, so I try to keep everything very in order and make sure that everybody knows what's coming up. So we'll do kind of a general kind of intro to Harriet. I would call her the most underrated author in American history. You've probably heard of Harriet. You know what she did. Everybody's like, yeah, Uncle Tom's Cabin. How many people have actually read Uncle Tom's Cabin? I won't ask for a show of hands, but it's actually probably one of the most famous books that people know about but have never read. And that's true for most visitors from the United States. However, most of our international visitors have read Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is more taught in other cultures and other languages today, I would say. So we'll talk about Harriet and just give you some general information about her. We'll look at ways to tie the Harriet Beecher Stowe into the social studies curriculum and English language arts. And then I'll look at some content information and resources that we offer on our website. And I'll show you where to find those and how to look at that. I'll talk about what our field trips options are, and then also what our plans are for next year, just in case things don't turn out in a way that field trips are not is easily accessible next year. And then there should be some time for questions. Is there anything that I need to be aware of or any specific questions to start with before we delve into everything? Linda's not saying anything. So
no, Christina, nobody's asked a question yet. So
all right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I like to open my school programs with a little story, and you may have heard this story before. I would call it kind of a mythological or apocryphal story. We don't know if it exactly happened this way. We do know that Harriet did visit President Lincoln at the beginning of December in 1862. She was visiting Washington, D.C. She visited her son, Fred, who was a Union Army soldier and was stationed in the capital at that time. She also visited the barracks of some contraband soldiers, so some African-American Union soldiers as well. And then she did call at the White House because, you know, she was pretty famous by that time, and Mrs. Lincoln had invited her to tea. The way the story goes, which is probably not exactly right, but when the president met Harriet, he said, "So you're the little lady who wrote that book that started this great big war." Now, we know that one person does not start an entire war, and we know that, that's not necessarily what Harriet's intentions were. However, what she did really was change public opinion. Before Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, people in the North, by and large, were not abolitionists. They were like, that slavery thing, it's down in the South. I don't want to worry about it. It doesn't affect me. But after Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's when people really started to think about the issue of slavery. And so Harriet, by writing this novel, was able to change public opinion about the issue of slavery in the United States, which is really a phenomenal task. So you have to wonder, okay, there's this white lady who grew up in New England. She was born in Connecticut, and yet she was the one that changed public opinion on slavery. How in the world was she able to do this? And it's really because of the 18 years that she lived in Cincinnati. So let's talk about Harriet's kind of journey to being able to write Uncle Tom's Cabin and her ability to change public opinion through living in Cincinnati. Now, Harriet grew up in New England. Like I said, she was she's part of a very large family. Her father was a famous Presbyterian minister. She was one of 11 children that survived to adulthood, right kind of in the middle. So 5 siblings older, 5 siblings younger. Most of her siblings were also social reformers in some respect. All 7 of her brothers became preachers at some time in their life, some more famous than others, including her brother Henry Ward Beecher. And then also she had 3 sisters, and of those 4 Beecher sisters, 3 of them had some kind of public presence. So really it was a very socially reform-minded family overall. But Harriet grew up in New England. She herself went to school. She started teaching at her sister. Her sister had started a girls' school. She started teaching there when she was 16. And then in 1832, the Beecher family moves to Cincinnati. Now at that point, Harriet is 21, but not married, so she moves with the family as well. And, what's the primary pull factor of migration? Why do people move across country? The answer is usually jobs, or that's often one of the answers. And that's true in this case. Lyman Beecher, Harriet's dad, got a new job. So he becomes the president of the Lane Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian training college out here in the West, located in Cincinnati, just 3 miles from the river in the neighborhood of Walnut Hills, which is kind of an up-and-coming suburb at the time. And then Harriet, by moving to Cincinnati, now all of a sudden she is exposed and meets all of these new people. She starts listening to their stories. And so she meets people who are pro-slavery. Cincinnati itself is a southern city. It is right on the border. And although slavery is not legal in Ohio, Cincinnati has so many ties into the southern economy, including with the pork industry. And it's just, there are so many pro-slavery business people in Cincinnati. So she's meeting them. She's also meeting abolitionists. She is meeting free blacks. There's a large free black community in Cincinnati. And then right across the river, now she's meeting slave slave owners and also enslaved people. So she's really kind of in this, mixture of different things and starting to listen to people's stories. Harriet also starts to learn more about abolition here in Cincinnati. Her family had always been against slavery. Her father was a colonizationist, and colonization is the idea that you free slaves eventually and send them back to Africa. Well, Harriet and most of her siblings really thought a little bit more radically than that and were abolitionists. And something significant happened at the Lane Seminary at her dad's college, and that is in 1834, just 2 years after they arrived, there were the Lane Seminary debates. And these were the first real abolition debates in the United States. They were led by this student. Here's a drawing of him. That's Theodore Weld. And then these two pictures at the bottom are from a movie about the Lane Seminary debates called Sons and Daughters of Thunder. This statue here is the only African-American student at the Lane Seminary, and during the debates he was giving actual testimony about experiences in his own life. And this statue is now located on the riverfront in Covington, which is on the Kentucky side of the river. But during these debates, Harriet has a firsthand listen to what's going on. And the students themselves were debating not pro and anti-slavery, they were debating colonization versus abolition. And at the end of these 18 days of debates, the students decide that they're all going to be abolitionists. Well, that's great, but think about the business community who is by and large pro-slavery, and they're the trustees of the college. Do you think they're going to let the college students do this? No, they tell them to stop. Well, how college students feel when they're told they can't do something. They just want to do it even more. So at that point, the students are going out into the free African-American community and ministering to them, teaching literacy classes, etc. There's a big controversy in terms of freedom of speech, what the students are allowed to do and not allowed to do. And most of those students end up leaving the Lane Seminary and going to Oberlin College up in Northern Ohio. So the whole idea, though, is that Harriet has this front row seat to what is going on the ground in terms of abolition. Theodore Weld himself goes on the abolitionist speaking circuit. He also later marries Angelina Grimke, who is another abolitionist and women's rights advocate. Another one of those protesters, another one of those students who are doing the debates is Henry Stanton, who later marries Elizabeth Cady. So we can already see some big tie-ins between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement of the 19th century as well. All right, so let's talk about Harriet and her writing career. Harriet, when she comes to Cincinnati, she'd always liked to write. Now she joins a reading and writing group called the Semicolon Club, and this is a group of mostly transplanted New Englanders. They kind of see themselves as the more elite of Cincinnati's society, including the Dr. Daniel Drake, including a young lawyer named Salmon P. Chase. These are members of the Semicolon Club. Harriet also joins, and it's really where she starts to get confidence as a writer, and she starts to publish short stories and essays. And you think of only Uncle Tom's Cabin when you hear Harriet Beecher Stowe's name, but she actually wrote a number of books. And in this magazine and newspaper column, that's kind of just the first time she published in each one of these periodicals. She would have had dozens of articles in each one. The first book that she wrote was a geography book for students. She had started teaching back in Connecticut, but then she and Catherine, her older sister, started another girls' school here in Cincinnati. So she was actually writing a geography book because she was teaching. Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of her first novels because Most of her earlier work was in that essay and short story range. And then after Uncle Tom's Cabin, she started writing more longer pieces. So here in Cincinnati now, Harriet has started to mix and mingle with all of these different people. She's become a more firm abolitionist. She's become a published writer. She also has friends who are Underground Railroad people. So one story is in terms of, this is the Rankin House out in Ripley. This is their house and this is their front yard. You can see this is kind of the quintessential, put a light in the window. You can see it from across the river in Kentucky. People knew where to go. There was also along the riverfront in Ripley, there's another Underground Railroad person named John P. Parker, and he was a formerly enslaved person who actually rode people across the river quite frequently and then pointed to the, where to go to the next house. This is where you need to end up, and would make their way up the hill to the Rankin House because of that. Well, the Rankins were also Presbyterian ministers. John and Jean Rankin lived in this house with their about 13 kids. I know it's a small looking house, but there's a couple bedrooms upstairs, and a couple of the Rankin sons did come over to the Lane Seminary. So the Rankins and the Stowes and the Beechers all knew each other very well. Harriet spent time out there, and so that's where she heard stories of people that the Rankins had actually assisted, and about freedom seekers, including the story of Eliza, a young woman who crosses the frozen Ohio River with her child in her arms and makes it to safety. So Harriet takes that true story from the Rankins and puts it into her book as one of the most famous episodes of the book. So that's one story, but there are other stories of how Harriet is she's not quite participating herself, but she knows the people who are, and she's kind of adjacent to the Underground Railroad. She also does a lot of research. So this house here is actually located in Washington, Kentucky, which is near Maysville. Harriet spent some time there in the 1830s. She, because she's a teacher, one of her students lives there. It's actually the Marshall Key House. The family of the Keys he was a lawyer here in Cincinnati, and his daughter came to her school. Well, Harriet and another teacher are invited to come visit during the summer. They go out there, and Harriet's like, oh, there's slaves here. And then she sees a slave auction that takes place just down the street. And it really kind of traumatized her in terms of, she didn't speak about it, she didn't write about it at the time, but 20 years later, she's able to describe a slave auction in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And when you open the first chapter of her book, it's located on a slave farm in Kentucky, very similar to this place. So she was able to utilize the information that she had gained years earlier. She also read narratives from formerly enslaved people like Frederick Douglass, like Josiah Henson. She even at one point, she wrote to Frederick Douglass and said, I've got one of my characters is going to end up on a plantation in Louisiana. Can you tell me some more information or point me in the right direction? So she was even researching as she was writing. She had a brother who lived in New Orleans and was telling her about what was going on in Louisiana. So all around, she was doing a lot of different points of research. And we can corroborate the information in a couple of different ways. One, the year after Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, and all of the Southerners were saying things like, don't believe it, it's a pack of lies. Well, Harriet comes out with a new book called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's basically a giant bibliography. It tells exactly where she learned all of these different stories. And in fact, if we look even recently, there was a movie a few years ago, 12 Years a Slave. That was the memoir of Solomon Northup. He was kidnapped in New York and ended up on a plantation in Louisiana. And the Solomon Northup memoir came out a year after Uncle Tom's Cabin. But if you look at the scenes that take place on those Louisiana plantations, they're almost identical. So Harriet was telling a fictional story, Solomon Northup was explaining what happened to him, but they really match up. So we know that the research that she did was very sound. She didn't travel in the far south. She only traveled in Kentucky, but she was still getting information from a lot of different places. Let's talk about Harriet's family life for just a minute. So this is Harriet and Calvin Stowe. Calvin was a biblical professor at the Lane Seminary. She actually met Calvin earlier. Calvin and his first wife, Eliza, were part of that semicolon club as well. So she knew him from the semicolon club. She knew him from her dad's college. She and Eliza Stowe became friends. And then Eliza Stowe dies in a cholera epidemic. And so Harriet's, upset that her friend is dead. Calvin's distraught that his wife has passed. And so the two of them start hanging out together more and more. 18 months later, they get married. And they get married right in her father's parlor, so right in the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. I should have mentioned that it's called the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, but it is actually the Beecher family home. Lyman Beecher lived there from the time it was completed in 1833 until the 1850s. And Harriet lived there kind of off and on before her marriage, and then after she got married, they lived in a house just down the street. So she was still in and out of the family home very frequently. The house itself is the only, construction, the only building left standing from that Harriet had associations with that's still left in Cincinnati. And also, it is the only building left standing from the Lane Seminary. It was actually part of the seminary property. It was owned by the seminary, and the Beechers lived there because he was the president. So Harriet moves down the street, but later that year, and this is 1836 now, later that year she comes back to live in the family home because Calvin's on a business trip to Europe and Harriet's pregnant, so she comes back to live in the family home, and that's why her first two children, twins, are born in the Harriet Beecher Stowe house or in the Beecher family home. Now, I know it says 7 kids, and you see 6 listed here, shown here. There's Hattie and Eliza. They were named after Calvin's first and second wives. There's Henry and Fred and Georgiana and Charles. But there is one missing, and I bet you can guess what happened, and he should be right here, but instead it's baby Charlie. And we do call him baby Charlie. He was 18 months old when he passed away from cholera in 1849. And he was her 6th child and the youngest at the time. The last child had not been born. So he was truly the baby of the family. And Harriet says, because of his passing and because of, what she has seen around her, she says that it gave her empathy towards slave mothers who lost their children, mostly to the auction block, but in terms of not being able to see your child again, not having that family connection anymore, it really gave her empathy towards slave mothers because of Charlie's passing. And, when you look at Uncle Tom's Cabin itself, one of the main plot lines is a woman protecting her child from being sold, and that's why Eliza escapes and makes it north to Canada. And then, but the idea of maternal loss really permeates throughout the book as well. So now, the year is 1850, and a couple of things happen. One, Calvin gets a new job, and so the Stowe family moves to Maine. The second is there's a new law passed, and the Fugitive Slave Act just makes Harriet angry. She's like, oh, this is a horrible law. I got to do something. What can I do? Well, it's 1850, and she's a woman. What can she do? One of her sister-in-laws writes her and says, you know what, Harriet? If I could write like you do, I would write and tell people how bad slavery really is. And she's like, that's a great idea. That's what I'm going to do. So she has a vision of what happens to Uncle Tom at the end of the book. While she's at church, remember it's a very religious family, they equate the idea of slavery with sin. Not all Christians do at that point, but she certainly does. And so she has a vision of Uncle Tom. She writes it all down. She shows it to her kids. The oldest ones are teenagers by this point. And they're like, oh, you got to keep going. So at that point, she writes a letter to the editor of an abolitionist newspaper that she's published in before. And she says, I've got a new story for you. It's going to be in about 4 parts. Will you publish it? He says yes. And then it ends up being in 40 parts and published a chapter a week for almost a year. So initially, Uncle Tom's Cabin was serialized in the National Era. And then after it was serialized, it was published in book form. Immediate bestseller. And what Uncle Tom's Cabin really does is it opens the eyes of Northerners. Before Uncle Tom's Cabin, people just didn't think about slavery. They didn't think it affected them. It wasn't, something that was in their daily thought process. But after Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's when people really started to understand what the importance of fighting against this was. So that's kind of my spiel on Harriet and why she's underrated, and how Cincinnati really plays a huge role in her ability to know how to tell the story and how to explain why slavery should not be around. So I'm going to stop for just a minute and ask, are there any questions about that before we move on to talk about the house and the resources that we provide to visitors and to educators?
Well, at this time, I see no questions.
Well, okay. All right. So at this point, we are a historic site. I hate to say the term house museum, because to me, house museum really implies having all the stuff. This is the bedroom that it was set up as, and this is the dining room set up, and we don't have any of that stuff. And part of the reason why is because Harriet's family lived there in the 1850s, and when they moved, they took all their stuff with them. And nobody knew that Harriet was going to be famous, so nobody kept anything. And it was actually a house for another 100 years. So, we have the rooms, we have the stories, we have the ability to tell what happened there, but we don't have all the, artifacty stuff. But this is actually the front of the house. Like I said, we're kind of using the side door as our visitor entrance now, but this is the front of the house, and unfortunately that porch is going to go because it's not original to the house. But this is, some of the rooms, and this staircase was added not during the Beecher time, but it was added during a 1908 renovation of the house. We do have a Harriet reenactor who works with us occasionally. That was at the Harriet birthday party a couple years ago. And then this is part of the original kitchen of the house. So we are preparing for a restoration project. Like I said, the front of the house and the north facade are going to be restored to what it looked like in the 1840s. They will also be restoring some of the interior rooms. The first phase of that project was completed this spring before everything shut down, but it was completed this spring, and that was foundation work, which needed to happen first. And then they'll work on masonry repair and replacing windows to make them look original and replacing shutters and so forth. But in the interior, as they were doing the research in preparation for the restoration, they did find the original fireplace. You can see there's an insert to it that was added in that 1908 time period where there was an addition to the house done at that point by the Montfort family. And so there's original fireplace and beehive oven over here. And so we hope to be able to restore that to look as it did in the 1840s. And that room really would have been kind of the test kitchen for Harriet's sister, Catherine. Catherine was a women's educator, but also a writer on domesticity. And she wrote cookbooks and also housekeeping manuals in terms of how to set up your house and housekeeping, despite the fact that she never married herself, but she was the bossy older sister of 11 siblings. So she had a lot of experience in terms of housekeeping for that reason. So a historic site. We also talk about the legacy of Harriet and a couple of different ways that we look at that. Like I said earlier, this is the only building left standing from the Lane Theological Seminary. So those first abolitionist debates in the United States. There is a historic marker right in front of where the main campus of Lane Seminary is, and that's just 2 blocks south of us on Gilbert. It is no longer a seminary. It is actually a Cadillac dealership now. So that's why you see the car in front of or right behind the Lane Seminary sign. But then that was in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. But later, the house itself, after the Beechers moved, other people lived there. Other professors, and then after 1865, it was purchased by a local family, the Montforts, and they're the ones that did an extensive addition to the house. And then by the late 1920s, there was one little old lady, Mary Montfort, living in the house, and the neighborhood of Walnut Hills had become a vibrant African-American business district. Well, you guys know what happens in American history. You got a little old white lady living in the middle of an African-American neighborhood. She moves out, but the house then turns into an African-American boarding house and a tavern, and the tavern part is listed in the Green Motorist book. So according to the 1940 census, there are 19 individuals living here, and then what is now our bookstore room was actually a tavern listed in the Green Motorist book. And all of the Green Book sites in Cincinnati were actually either in the neighborhood of Walnut Hills or in the neighborhood of the West End. In the 1940s then, there was a concerted effort to save the house, so to speak. So the Harriet Beecher Stowe Memorial Association was founded in 1943. It was a group of citizens, both white and African American, who come together and say, you know what, we know this house was the old Beecher homestead. We know that it is now a tavern. We want to make sure that it doesn't fall down, it doesn't go into disrepair, it doesn't get turned into a gas station. And so they raised money to be able to turn the house into a historic site. And the original goals of that committee was to create an African American cultural center and a memorial to Harriet. They called it a lighthouse symbolizing goodwill and better understanding. And remember, this is during World War II. So that particular group was able to purchase the house, and it was then turned over to the Ohio Historical Society, which is now the Ohio History Connection. So we are an Ohio History Connection site within their site system. Let's see. But we also are, my son's leaving for work, sorry. We're a museum of ideas. Because we don't have all the stuff, we think about in terms of what can we have people think about, what can we offer to visitors and program participants that really demonstrates, the ideas, the thinking skills. So we have this is from a discussion group that we have. We have school groups, and this was a reformers group. This was actually a couple years ago, Walnut Hills High School, which is located just right 3/4 of a mile up the street from us. They brought their AP history class and had a 19th century reformers debate inside Lyman Beecher's house, which was really kind of cool. And then, all right, so I'm going to stop again and see if there are any questions before we move on.
Well, actually, I have a question for you. You made a quick reference to a beehive oven. What is a beehive oven?
A Beehive oven is a stone oven that, or well, brick, probably most likely brick, but it's shaped kind of with a dome shape, and that's why it gets the name beehive oven. If you just Google beehive oven, you'll be able to see a picture of what it looks like, and that, you know, you can see in our, if I go back a few slides, oops. You can see kind of the curvature of the beehive oven. I don't know if you can you see my cursor move?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a curvature to it, and basically, so it is a bread baking oven that's right next to the cooking fireplace, and then there would just be a storage area underneath for wood, and so it would get its heat from the fireplace, and then that's where bread would be made.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we keep going?
No more questions in the chat box.
All right, so ways to tie Harriet Beecher Stowe into your curriculum, because, like I said, people should be talking more about this person. So I do a couple of different, I do several different school programs. I was a teacher for 10 years in a district here in Cincinnati, and I taught 10th grade history. So, you know, a little bit later time period, but my focus for the field trips are within 8th grade standards and then also within 4th grade standards. Now, those can be expanded in multiple ways, as I know you're aware of. But specifically looking at the program that I do, you know, what I showed you on the slides for each of those different categories. So moving to Cincinnati is one category. Becoming an abolitionist is one category. Becoming a writer. The way that I set up our standard school programs are, there's an introduction, we do a little skit with Harriet and Abraham Lincoln, and then I break the students into groups, and each group gets a set of primary and secondary source documents. And each group, their documents point to the fact that Harriet's becoming an abolitionist. Another group gets Harriet's becoming a writer. Another group gets the Friend of the Underground Railroad documents. So each group then discovers one characteristic or one factor about Harriet, and then they report back to the class. So it's a jigsaw activity that really gets the students thinking and utilizing those sources. But in order to, you know, kind of, these are the tie-ins to the specific curriculum for those. So in terms of 8th grade, you know, these are the content standards, including informed citizens understand how media and communication and technology influence public opinion. And then, you know, English language arts, everything ties back to that. You can find English language arts standards in everything that you do. So these are just the examples of what I have pulled out saying, okay, here's my 8th grade program, and it hits these and it hits these. And then I also frame at the beginning of our presentation for students, you know, some overarching questions, which one was the one that we talked about in terms of how was this white woman raised in New England able to change public opinion? And then how did Harriet use information from a variety of sources, going back to that, you know, primary source idea? And then how did Uncle Tom's Cabin influence public opinion? So going back to that specific 8th grade standard. I also, you know, kind of just throw in lots of different, you know, thinking questions as we go. So, you know, what does the term antebellum mean? I have to tell you, most 8th graders have no clue. However, 8th graders at Walnut Hills High School do usually are able to tell me, because at that point they've already had 2 years of Latin. So most of those 8th graders are able to tell you what antebellum means when I say, okay, put together the Latin words. And they're like, oh yeah, okay. But we talk about, what the term means and why it would not have been used during the time period. But so those are kind of the overarching questions that frame the 8th grade program. And then similarly, the 4th grade standards, again, talking about sectional issues, talking about movement, and, talking about Underground Railroad. So the 4th grade overarching questions, still focus on that, how was she able to do this? And then how did she use Underground Railroad information? And so the second half of the 8th grade program focuses on that changing public opinion. The second half of the 4th grade program focuses on Underground Railroad. So let me show you some different content info on our website, which you could be using now, you could use for your own edification, you could use in lots of different ways. So I'm just going to go through some information from our website to kind of show you some resources. So when you look at our website, which is just stowhousecincy.org, we are temporarily closed. Yes, we've been closed to the public since March 14th, and we do not have a reopen date yet. Unfortunately, the governor has not said that museums and historic sites are allowed to open yet. We're kind of low down on the list of information. We're kind of lumped in with amusement parks and stuff like that, but then you go down another line and it says no museums, zoos, aquariums, etc. But if you look at the website and you go to the blog section, this is where we've been posting a lot of content even while we're closed. So we've actually been utilizing the blog even more now than we did previously, because this is one of the ways that we're still putting out information to people. And a lot of our blog content right now is being written by our volunteer docents who can't give tours right now. So they have been reading, writing, researching, and sending in information. We have one series where it's called Visiting Harriet's Literary Neighborhood. This is the 6th post from that particular series, and this is written by a retired Xavier literature professor who leads one of our discussion groups. And he has been talking about, different people, 19th century writers, and what their relationship is to Harriet and her ideas, and how Harriet influenced various people and what things are similar. So we've got one on Rebecca Harding Davis. We've got another one on Harriet Jacobs and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. We also have been having our docents answer virtual questions. So it's a way for the docents to continue to be able to do something. This one was actually written by one of our youth docents who is an 8th grader. And so just giving more information. We had our other staff member who was on a podcast with the Cincinnati Art Museum a couple weeks ago, Volunteer Spotlight. So it just gives you lots of different information in different formats that's related to Harriet. And if you go back through the archives, you can look at previous postings as well. So more docent questions. Oops. Here's another docent question about family tension. So some of the family members were abolitionists, some were colonizationists. How did that play out? So just different ideas and different ways to learn about related issues. We also, if you go up to the tab that says virtual tour, on the week right after we closed to the public, I went through and did a video segment in each of the rooms to do kind of a video version of our tour, and we doled that out a little bit at its time through our social media, and it's now all available to, we've posted all of them now, so it's now all available to see, so you can go through a virtual tour. Now I have to admit, this was like the first thing we did video-wise, and so I didn't realize that I should have my stepson was the cameraman. He should have held the camera landscape instead of portrait, but you live and learn. So then there's also, under the Discover the History section, you can learn more about the Beecher family and all of those social reformers that were in the Beecher family. You can also learn about the 20th century history of the house. If we go there. So this talks about the 20th century history of the house, which I kind of talked about in our talk. And then also, if you want to know more about the Lane Seminary, this actually links to a website called Cause for Freedom. And this was one of our volunteers who was a student at Worcester College a couple of years ago, and this was her senior thesis project. So if you go through that, you can access her senior thesis project, which was information, a lot of primary source information. She actually went to Philadelphia, which is where the Lane Seminary archives are now. The seminary itself closed in 1932, merged with McCormick Seminary, sorry, these two words are too close, seminary in Chicago, but then the archives from Lane went to the Philadelphia Presbyterian archives. And then we also have information about discussion groups. So if you click join the discussion, we have two different discussion groups. There's the Semicolon Club, which discusses books, and we have moved that series online. So the February one we had in-house, that was actually a documentary viewing, and then the April one we actually did an online Zoom meeting with it. And because we were able to because we moved it online, we actually got the author of the book who teaches at Miami to be our main speaker, and she basically just answered everyone's questions. It was a great discussion itself. And then the Year of the Woman discussion series, which is led by Dr. Getz from Xavier, and that actually happens on the first Wednesday of the month with very specific topics you can see. Short readings, and then a discussion about that. We take a hiatus during the summer, so our fall series is not up here, but that will either be in-house or online, depending on what things look like in the fall. So let's go to, oops.
Well, Christina, we do have a question for you.
Okay, please.
Any ideas for fifth grade social studies and or integration between ELA and social studies for fifth grade?
Well, now fifth grade is goes through I'm trying to remember. Fifth grade is basically the Western Hemisphere.
Correct.
And so you can do some more information in terms of, what was the, contact points between different cultures. You can talk about the issues of sectionalism again and kind of reiterate that. And then also, how do people learn about other things? So, Harriet, because she was coming to, she moved from Connecticut to Cincinnati, she was able to gather information in a lot of different ways. So I have had classes in the fifth grade range who do the fourth grade program, and we modify it just a little bit. So kind of the similar or same types of information that come from that.
Thank you. And for our participants, you'll see that I posted the link for the Google Doc for the contact hour. So if you click on that link or copy and paste that into your browser, you can go to the Google Doc and sign up for the contact hour. Those certificates will come in the next week or so. And I don't see any more questions for Christina, but we can certainly hang out for a little bit and see if anybody does have more questions. And
can I show one more thing?
You bet.
In terms of resources, so if you go to the resources or the education page of our website, so it's under Visit the House and School Groups, we have here this particular resource guide, which has information about how to get started on essays and reviews, some activities to do, which can either be done in the classroom or could be sent out to students. And then some longer lesson plans about Harriet Beecher Stowe that you could use all or parts of. So this is a good, kind of introduction to how would I start using resources from Harriet. And then also, and then also on the education portion of our site, here's a couple of activities. This is the Beecher family video chat. Before there was video chats, the Beechers kept in contact through what was called the circular letter. And so there's information about that and how to create your own circular letter to spread amongst your family. And then another document on influencing public opinion. So this is kind of the follow-up information to that junior high, or I use that program in high school English language arts classes as well. And this is kind of takes some quotes from Uncle Tom's Cabin and has the students actually reacting to that. So those are some resources that are available on our website as well. And then in terms of next year, these are our current offerings. We do a third grade program that is Ruth in the Green Book, because we talk about that, local history connection in terms of that. And then, the Harriet and Cincinnati program is aimed for 4th, 8th, and high school students, but it can bridge the gap. We also do have a lot of homeschool families that come as well, and they're multi-age. So we are able to adapt and adjust a little bit. And then we've also done current offerings on the Real Uncle Tom and Women and Allies. Our plans for the 2020 and 21 school year are kind of up in the air in terms of we are certainly going to be offering the same types of field trip and outreach programs. However, we are also looking at ways to make it a more virtual edition of that, so that we can also assist if field trips are not as readily available next year, either by the state or by your district, etc. So those are just kind of what's in the works for us this summer, is creating that more distance learning program. And then there's my contact information as well if anybody wants to contact me directly. But I will ask if there are any more questions.
Well, there are no more posted questions, but we can certainly hang out still. And thank you so much, Christina. I've learned a lot, and there's a lot to think about in what you've presented today. So I really appreciate your time and your sharing with us today.
Sure.